Hi guys, this is Max from Make It Conscious. Hope you're all doing well today. So today I'm going to be talking about habit 2 of the 7 habits of individuation, and that is to cultivate wholesome intentions. So following on from yesterday, habit 1, take responsibility for your mind, habit 2 naturally builds on this because habit 1 is all about understanding, taking responsibility based on that understanding. Habit 2, therefore, takes the understanding and makes a decision. So habit 2 is really about keeping these intentions close to mind, which gives our mind something to unify around. So, a lot of our challenges in life come from the fact that we, on some level, haven't decided. We have conflict, we don't know what to do in situations. So with habit 2, we've taken the model and now we say, okay, I'm going to decide to do what is conducive to wholeness in this situation and in my life generally. So cultivate wholesome intentions, again, like all the habits, breaks down into 3 key facets, which I will discuss in this video. But the general idea here is that it sets an aspiration to become whole. It makes a conscious choice. And it says that I am going to choose to move towards individuation. I'm going to move towards wholeness and away from separation. And it essentially is a choice to live better. It's a choice to suffer less and to have more joy and to live with more meaning. And so it's a choice that we make because it seems like a good idea for us. It's the right thing for us to do. But there's a reason we call it wholesome intentions and not good intentions. When we start talking about good and bad and right and wrong, these ideas, of course, exist in polarity to each other. And what is that? That is an ego construct. This is the ego trying to find a foothold. It's making some things good and then it casts the opposite as bad. It thinks that some things are right and it casts the opposite of wrong. So whilst these terms do loosely apply and make sense to this path and to the aspiration of cultivating wholesome intentions, they're not the most accurate words. You'd be forgiven for saying that was a good decision and I think you were right there and that sort of thing. But it is loosely accurate only, and we have to be very careful thinking this way because that is a very tempting way for the ego to get involved and start thinking in terms of right and wrong. And so whilst on some level I do think it's a good thing that people move towards wholeness, and I do think in some sense it's the right thing if it is the right thing for you and if it's the right time, it wouldn't be wholesome of me to go around saying that everybody ought to do this and that this is the right thing and this is the way for most people. If you're expressing an interest in individuation, then I would suggest that this is a function of your mind and maybe even a calling from the higher self, which renders it at this point in time a good idea for you. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that it is cultivating good intentions, although you can't really say it's not doing that. But a more accurate word is wholesome because we're moving towards wholeness, and that is the process of life, that is evolution, that is the aspiration that our higher mind calls us to. And so if that is what has brought you here at this point in time, let's call it a good thing. But for the purposes of this habit, we're cultivating wholesome intentions. So the first facet of habit 2 is to cultivate the intention to look. This aligns with the first cause of suffering we discussed in habit 1. The first facet there was to understand the unconscious, and the cause of suffering there is that we're not whole. There are things we don't see. In habit 2, facet 1, we are now saying, set the intention to look. Now, this might sound like a bit of a funny thing at first, because why do we have to set this intention to look? Well, the primary reason is that the idea of the unconscious is naturally a little bit unintuitive to us as humans. And the reason for this is that the ego has been in control for much of our lives. The ego is our sense of self that is pulling together all our conscious data and trying to create a consistent narrative. And this, of course, serves a useful purpose. It helps us to survive, not least, but also to belong socially. The mind is telling us at all times, like, this makes total sense, this makes total sense, I get this, I understand what's going on here, until we don't, right? Until something comes in, chaos emerges, and we have an experience of life that just completely throws us for a loop. Our models haven't accounted for it at all. And this can be something that occurs in the external world, it can be a pain, a trauma. And, you know, of all of that, perhaps the most painful thing is when that very sense of self is what is perturbed or even shattered completely. It's when that ego is questioned and a new identity perhaps starts to form, but it's based around not this drive to be a self and experience a consistent narrative, but to attain to wholeness. And this is where the drive from the higher self comes from. As part of this first facet, we accept the call, we look for opportunities to expand consciousness, and we do this actively. Now, I don't need to give a huge amount of guidance around this particular point, because this is something that when it's happening, we know it's happening. Or we might have examples from our past where we then remember in retrospect, okay, I was guided in some sense there. There was a sign of some sort. This is something that starts to happen a lot as an individual begins the journey to individuation. If there is a line in the sand on this path, because if there is, there's only this one. Generally speaking, this is a very gradual journey. However, there is a kind of threshold that is crossed at the point where an individual decides to stop merely doing what was expected of them and start being more true to themselves. And of course, we're always doing both of those things in some balance, but there is a point where the inner force quietly perhaps overtakes the outer force. Often this happens around midlife. If it's especially challenging, it might result in the classic midlife crisis. It's a trope that we can probably all understand and recognize in some capacity. So there is a kind of line in the sand, but it's a conceptual line in the sand. And beyond that point, this is the start of the individuation process. And it's often around this time that the call to action starts to appear. It might appear as some kind of symbol, some kind of invitation. It can take countless forms, but the only piece of guidance here is to accept that call when it arises. So that first facet, just to recap, is to cultivate the intention to look, i.e. to look into the unconscious, to know more about your mind, the mind, and do that based on the understanding from habit one that this is moving us in a wholesome direction for where we are right now. The second facet of habit two is to cultivate the intention to let go. So you're probably seeing the pattern here, because of course the second cause of suffering is craving. And so what we're doing here in habit two, cultivate the intention to let go. We understand, first of all, that our craving for things in this world and for ideas and for views and what we've identified with as an individual and our persona, this is a huge cause of all of our suffering. Therefore, we understand if we let go of that craving, we can abandon the suffering, we can reclaim that projection. And so by cultivating the intention to let go, again, it gives us that decisiveness. So whenever we encounter a situation in life where previously we might not have been sure what to do, by practicing habit two, keeping that intention close to mind, close to consciousness, we lean in the direction of letting go, what the Buddhists might refer to as renunciation. So the Buddhists practice this as well, and they set the intention to go forth and to abandon worldly things. And we don't have to do that, but by setting that intention, we can benefit in much the same way as ascetics do in Buddhism, by understanding that the more we let go and the more we intend to let go, the more we're going to be able to find that peace, joy, and freedom within ourselves. So this doesn't mean that we stop enjoying the world, that we completely abandon worldly pleasures, but it's a mental shift where we stop clinging to those things. What that really means is that we stop seeing them as separate to us. We set the intention to let go of them, allow them to come, allow them to go. And we do that on the recognition that they are, on some level, a reflection of our own mind. And so, I'm in Tbilisi, Georgia right now, for example. I enjoy the city very much. One day I'm going to have to leave. And when I do, I'm not going to miss it. And that's not because I don't enjoy the city. It's because I set the intention to let go. And often by simply setting that intention, that is actually enough. There's more we can do, and there's further tools we'll come onto in later habits that bolster and further facilitate this process. But often just that simple intention, like I said, removes that ambiguity, not just the decision of what to do in this moment, but that mental ambiguity, that mental fragmentedness that comes from having not truly made a decision. That's often a lot of what actually is causing us to suffer. It's that torment by different options. So by setting the intention to let go, we erode a large part, if not all of that, and that can often be enough just simply to move on. This particular facet builds off the premise that often what we do, if we're not setting the intention to let go, is we almost assume that the road to joy and happiness in life is to make things just so. If we can just build enough, if we can just get just the right systems, or if we can all agree on that perfect set of values, if we can find the theory of everything, or if we can just get everybody to be nice to each other all the time, then we'll be okay. Then we'll have no more problems. And of course, this can never work, because all this does is this just assumes that what we're experiencing out here is what there is. And of course, what we're really experiencing is a reflection of ourselves, or it's a rendering by our mind, which goes far, far deeper than our conscious experience can possibly experience right now in this world. So there's always going to be content in the unconscious as unaccounted for by any model. And so it can never fully account for everything, and it will therefore inevitably break down in some way, eventually, sooner or later. So I think we all understand on some level that craving can never fully be satisfied. It always wants more. And the reason for this might well be because it itself is not whole. It itself is imbalanced. So for example, if we rely really heavily on our own internal logic, then we may do that at the expense of group values, helping people get their needs met. And likewise, if we rely too heavily on, say, building these perfect external systems, we may do that with under-reliance on our own personal value system. So this, again, is a Jungian concept. It's about personality type and the preferred functions we use for making decisions. And so a solution may actually be found, again, in bringing the mind back to wholeness, in integrating the opposites. And the issue with craving is that it doesn't do that. It relies very heavily on usually one form of decision making, and then assumes that the answer that that mode gives equates to some kind of truth per se, because it has worked, because it has produced some kind of result in the past, or at least that's how it seems. But of course, it doesn't know what it doesn't know. So craving can never be fully satisfied when used in this way, because it's not reflective of the whole. So this second facet of cultivating the intention to let go really works because it encourages us to let go of what we think we are, the things we've identified with, whether it is our persona, whether it is our sense of self, whether it's a viewpoint, whether it's even a sense sensation, a particular type of food. On some level, the mind is identifying with these things. It thinks that they are needed to be whole. And so by letting go, we're essentially letting go of what we think we are. The third facet of habit 2 is to cultivate the intention to love. Now, love is absolutely a wholesome thing, because love, essentially, we could think about it as having active goodwill for all creatures. And this is of course, completely conducive to wholeness and unity. And in much the same way as letting go is an antidote to craving, love is an antidote to aversion, because when we don't love, when we have issues with other people, when there's aspects of them we don't like, well, we know from the shadow work that we are really, on some level, rejecting a part of ourselves. What triggers us and what we find most displeasing about others are the repressed aspects of our own personality. And again, it doesn't mean that we are those things. It doesn't mean that, say, if we really take particular issue with people who appear to us as selfish, it doesn't mean that we are selfish, because that would be a judgment, right? That would be a label by the ego. But what it means is that we have repressed that side of us, and therefore we have a conditioned fear against being that way or being perceived that way. And so the mind, naturally, when it sees it externally, it projects. It can necessarily only see it as arising externally. And so what we do when we love is we actually essentially stop pushing away those parts of ourselves that we have previously repressed. And so by cultivating love for others, we also cultivate love for ourselves. We stop hating and pushing away those parts of ourselves. We can break this down a bit further. So when we think of love, we can think of loving kindness more broadly. And this is a term that's often used in spiritual circles and particularly Buddhism. Loving kindness, what does that mean? Well, we can think of that as the active goodwill for all creatures that I mentioned earlier. This also breaks down further. We can think of it in terms of, firstly, compassion, which we can describe as concern for the misfortune of other creatures. And we can also think of it in terms of sympathetic joy, which, as it sounds, is taking joy in others' well-being. Of course, the theme that underpins all of this is essentially treating others as we would ourselves, as we would like to be treated. This is, again, very simple, practical advice that makes sense when we consider that the world is us in some sense, and what we perceive out there is a reflection of ourselves. And so if we take that advice and treat others as we would like to be treated, we will then start to find that we are treated the way we'd like to be treated. On the other hand, if we cultivate unwholesome intentions, then we'll find that those are the things that then start to show up for us in life. So what's interesting here is that if letting go, the second facet, is really about letting go of who and what we think we are, then there's a flip side to that, right? And that is the intention to love, which is integrating what we've hidden. So on one hand, we are letting go of what we think we are. On the other hand, we are integrating what we've hidden. And both of these are absolutely vital, both of equal importance, really. So in terms of how we actually practice these, well, a lot of that will be covered in later habits, such as habit 5, which is about managing our state, and habit 7, which is about meditation. So we'll be looking at, for example, loving kindness meditation, which is when we actively cultivate loving kindness and abandon that aversion in our minds. So when we talk about habit 2, again, this is really about making a decision. It's setting that intention. And so that when we come into a situation where we are essentially faced with two options, we can take the loving option, we can take the aversion option, our mind is going to lean towards the loving option because we've firstly understood habit 1, that we must take responsibility for our mind if we are at the point where we're looking to attain to wholeness. And based on that understanding, we move to habit 2. At that point, we set the intention. So we keep that intention close to mind. And then when a situation comes up where we previously either would have decided unskillfully or left it to a whim based on how we felt at that moment, our physiology, well, by keeping this intention close to mind, we're more likely to lean in the direction of a wholesome choice. It's not going to happen every time, and certainly aren't going to look at beating ourselves up about this. There's no points to be won here that give you special access to anything or anything like that. It's really just about setting that intention and working with what we've got to do that. So I'm going to leave that there for now, guys. I hope that was useful, and I shall chat to you next time.